As a reformed accountant and a property investor, I always try and get the highest possible profit for the least amount of risk. And so typically what that means is, rather than trying to find the latest, greatest hotspot, is actually going for suburbs that typically tend to double every single decade. So we're going for a guarantee pretty much, and going for calculated and informed risk. So for instance, I'm mainly trying to get suburbs that will always do well. So typically those are the inner city suburbs to the main capital cities, because it means that there's no more land around. There's plenty of demand from all the workers that want to be close to the cities and want to be close to the beaches, as opposed to the more rural areas where there is a lot more land and not necessarily as much demand. The other important thing is to try and get renters all the time. So if I'm buying around the median price, it means that the majority of the population can afford to rent it, and if I had to sell in an emergency, they can afford to buy it at the same time as well. I'm always happy paying a fair price for a blue chip property in a blue chip suburb, because I think it will make more money in the long term than basically buying a cheap property in a cheap suburb that no one really wants. So even though you might be able to save 50 grand on a 500 grand property, if no one really wants it, it's not really going to necessarily grow in value over the long term. Buying a property a week has enabled me to basically bulk purchase things. So as well as I'm buying for me, I'm buying for my clients as well. And if I'm buying a property a week, I can get much better deals from the agents than I can if I'm buying one a year. Because ultimately, I don't want to go to auction. I don't want to compete with everyone else, because that's generally going to drive the price up in a hot market. Whereas if I can get agents to sell me stuff before it comes on the market or within the first few days, because I've got my dollars ready, I've done my research, I'm good to go, then quite often I'm going to get better deals. So the whole thing about this thing is not trying to necessarily concentrate on making a profit overnight, it's thinking longer term, because longer term means you're taking less risk and there's a greater chance you're going to profit from it. Most people can't believe that a 3-bedroom unit is cheaper than a 1-bed, but it can be. It's all a case of thinking slightly differently. Now, when I was in my early 20s, I was like everyone else. I didn't earn that much money, didn't have much of a deposit. I saw a 1-bedroom unit, and basically when I worked out the mortgage, I knew I'd have no money left. It would consume all of my income. Whereas I carried on looking, I fell in love with a 3-bedroom house, and I thought, well, how can I make this work? How can I get the numbers to work for me so I can afford it? And what I worked out was, if I get 2 mates to come and rent rooms, then effectively they're going to pay most of the mortgage. Because the big difference is, a 3-bedroom house doesn't cost 3 times as much as a 1-bedroom unit. It may only cost something like double. And so certainly when I started investing, rent returns were pretty high, and so I almost lived for free. But the trouble is, for most young people, is they can't afford a 3-bedroom house because they're on limited wages. And so one of the keys to that strategy was trying to find like a parent to guarantee your mortgage. So you're not actually asking them to give you money, it's really just give you the guarantee for the first few years that you'll pay the mortgage, and then effectively the cash works out. So the main thing to look at is see what the numbers tell you, not what you've been told by your parents or basically by society. So many people are worried about debt, and that's the way we've all been brought up. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have that thought in your mind. Pretty much everyone has. But the thing you've got to realise is that businesses every day all around the world borrow money because they've got limited resources, and they use that money to put it to better use. And there's no reason why you can't do that personally. But debt is dangerous. It's brought down many an investor and many an entrepreneur as well. So you do definitely have to be careful, and you shouldn't take things lightly. So the most important things to do is to buy the right kind of assets, and ideally appreciating assets, things like property that are pretty stable. Now, if you buy good property in good suburbs, it's not as volatile as some other property, and so it's less likely to fall. And if you're borrowing that money, you really do need some solid assets behind you. The main other thing that you need to be aware of is cash flow. And I believe sometimes you actually need to borrow more money, because that can be safer than borrowing less. Because if you're completely geared, you've got no other income, quite often the rent won't cover the mortgage, so you're running out of cash. Whereas if you actually borrow a buffer, you might even borrow 2 or 3 years buffer to help cash flow that property, it can actually be safer borrowing 600 than it is 500, because you've got that 100 grand aside. Now ideally you don't want to use that money, it's really to be kept in an emergency, and so that the only time generally you lose money from property is when you have to sell it very, very quickly. And so even though some people might argue, well, borrowing that extra 100 grand is going to cost you more, it's actually cheaper than selling the property and having to buy it back in a couple of years' time. So the main thing again is look at the numbers, because the numbers tell you a completely different story. If you're trying to decide what's better, 1, 2 or even maybe 3 bedroom units, it's all going to depend on you and what your investing strategy is all about. Because what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other, and it depends on what market you're buying into as well. So typically the main issue with buying 1 bedroom units is they're only going to appeal to a certain proportion of the market, and generally a very small proportion, because typically you've got no one to share the bills with. They're still reasonably expensive. You might be spending still 500 or 600 grand on that unit, and so not many people are going to rent it or perhaps buy it off you if you need to sell it. Whereas for 2 bedroom units, straight away there's lots of people that are 20 or 30 years old, young professionals, even people straight out of university, that will get together with a mate. They'll suddenly share all the bills 50-50, and they're very, very happy sharing together. So you then might say, well, what about getting a 3 bedroom property, because then that reduces it even more. The problem is, though, is once you start getting into your late 20s and early 30s, you don't want a 3 share. Suddenly it's too many people. It's all right at university, but not when you've got a job and you're trying to get a good night's sleep and try and behave some of the time. So look, certainly if I was buying, and I was buying in Sydney or Melbourne or the inner city suburbs, I would definitely be looking at 2 bedroom units, because I think it appeals to a lot of the population, it's nice and affordable, and they're the kind of things that you can sell pretty much overnight.